Hey, Bio 150 folks. So this will be our last in our series of lectures talking about the adaptations plants have to regulate their water content. If you've not viewed the previous lectures, please make sure you check those out before you get into this lecture. So the previous lectures covered some of the adaptations plants use to talk about water. Once again, be sure to watch those previous lectures first if you haven't looked at those yet. First of all, we've talked about the roles of vacuoles and cell walls in all of the green plants. We've talked about the roles of the cuticle and stomata in the land plants. And next, in this lecture, we'll be talking about vascular tissue and other structural adaptations that have evolved in plants to help them survive on land. We had talked about in the previous lecture this transition to land and the idea that land plants evolved about 480 million years ago, and they had make this transition from an aquatic environment where they first evolved to a terrestrial environment on land. And along that came a lot of big obstacles to surviving on dry land. Number one is water loss from evaporation. And we talked about how cuticle and stomata that evolved in land plants help deal with this particular obstacle. And in this lecture, what we're going to talk about is this next obstacle. So we're going to talk about how land plants use vascular tissue to get water from the soil up to the rest of the plant. So when we talk about vascular tissue, essentially what we're talking about is tissue that helps transport water and sugar through taller plants from the soil and the roots up through the rest of the plant. And one of the major components of this vascular tissue is something called lignin. And basically lignin is the strongest part of the vascular tissue, and it provides strong structural support. And you can think of vascular tissue sort of being like tissue that makes up a straw. And so it's sort of like a long tube, and those tubes are lined with this strong structural lignin tissue. And so lots of cells are making up these sort of long straw-like tubes that run through a plant. So think of that as a straw, and when you combine a lot of these straws together, a lot of this vascular tissue together, it basically creates a transport system to move water and sugars throughout the whole plant. So this is sort of like the plant equivalent to a human circulatory system. So this is just a sort of simplified diagram of a human circulatory system, and just like the circulatory system helps to move blood and oxygen and nutrients and things like that all through a human's body, the vascular tissue in a plant helps move water and sugar and hormones and other nutrients through the plant's body. So this is basically a system set up for bulk flow, if you can remember back to those key adaptations for multicellularity. Okay. So where is vascular tissue in a plant? Typically it's found in bundles running through the roots, stems, and leaves. So if we're to look at this sort of simplified diagram of a typical sort of plant, you've got the below ground root system, and you've got the above ground shoot system. And that shoot system basically needs to get water and other nutrients from the soil. So those water nutrients need to come in through the roots, and then they're transported through the vascular tissue that runs through the sort of tips of roots all the way through to the main sort of stem or branch of the plant. And then those vascular tissues also run out into the individual leaves so that all parts of the plant can have water and nutrients delivered to them. So if we were to take a cross section of this sort of shoot section, it would look something like this, where there's a bunch of vascular tissue bundles. So each of these things represents a vascular bundle that's running through the main stem of the leaf. And the red parts represent spots where sugars running back and forth up and down through the plant. So typically sugars are produced in the leaves by all the photosynthesis, and then they'll run down to the roots and the other parts of the plant where sugars are not produced, so that sugars can get to all the different cells of the plant. And then those blue parts represent water and nutrients, which are typically sucked up through the roots and moved to other parts of the plant where water and nutrients are needed. And if we were to take one of those vascular bundles and blow them up and sort of zoom in on it, and this is sort of a stained cross-section of one of those vascular bundles right here. And what you can see is you've got this outer ring of what's called phloem, and this inner ring of what's called xylem, okay? So the phloem is around the outside, and then that's bundled around the xylem, which is in the inside. And that xylem, its job is to carry the water and dissolved nutrients from the soils up to the rest of the plant. The phloem, its job is to carry sugars and other substances typically down from the leaves down to the other parts of the plant that need it. But they can also actually move up sometimes. Essentially, the sugars are going to move from places that don't have sugars, so those are sinks, and from places that do have sugars, which are sources, to places that don't have sugars, which are sinks. And so oftentimes that's from the leaves to the roots, but sometimes those can be from older leaves to younger leaves that haven't started doing photosynthesis yet. And so how is water moved through the xylem from the roots to the rest of the leaves? In other words, how do you get enough water from the base of this tree and the soil and the roots all the way up to the very tip top of this really, really tall tree? How do you move water against gravity? How do trees do this? Well, essentially what it does is suck. So obviously this is not the same way that us sucking on a straw works, but in a lot of ways it is very similar. Instead of using sort of muscle movements of pursing your lips and pulling with those muscle movements, trees create this suction through evapotranspiration, okay? So what causes the pull of water up the plants? It's something called transpiration. And so what we're looking at here is a diagram of a sort of simplified diagram of a plant. We've got the roots down below, and you've got to zoom in on the roots here. You've got the stem in the middle, where you got to zoom in on this little section here. And then you've got the leaf up here, and you've got to zoom in on this little section here. And so the first thing that happens in this sort of diagram of how transpiration works is you have evaporation of water, basically causing water to get sucked out of the leaf. So you have water leaving the leaf through an open stoma. And that basically what that does is as this water moves, all of these little water molecules are linked to one another through hydrogen bonds. And so in the same way that if you suck on one end of a straw, it pulls up the water at the bottom of the straw. It's because all of those water molecules are bonded to one another, okay? So hydrogen bonds that form between those water molecules allow the water to get pulled up from the xylem. And so this evaporation here basically causes suction on each individual molecule, and those individual molecules run in a stream of water the whole way down into the roots. And so here you can see the roots, now that water is getting sucked in from the environment through the roots, basically, and being pulled through the entire plant and this vascular tissue by this evaporation that's happening up at the top leaf here. And so the result of transpiration is essentially you get delivery of water and dissolved minerals from the roots to the leaves. So water gets sucked in through the leaves, travels up through the leaf, and evaporates from the leaf surface. So this has the advantage of delivering water to all the places that it's needed in the plant. And it also, some minerals will also get delivered to different parts of the plants as well. In addition, this can cool off the plant. So just like your sweat cools you off through that evaporative process, this water can help to thermoregulate and cool the plant as well, which is important for plants as well. And the best part about this is that it's free. So I want to emphasize that all of this is entirely driven by the sun's energy. So just the sun using its energy to evaporate the water off of those leaves creates this suction that pulls nutrients up and also pulls water up through the rest of the plant. So it just uses sun's energy and those cohesive hydrogen bonds, bonding properties of water, basically to do all of this water flow through an entire big plant. No ATP is required from the plant. So think about that in contrast to a human being that has to expend a lot of energy pumping its heart to have a sort of circulatory system running through, keep the circulatory system running. Plants get to do that for free in this case. Okay, so when we talk about this transition to land, we talk about the main obstacles to surviving on land. We talked about water loss and getting water from soil to the rest of the plant, and we talked about the evolutionary solutions that land plants have come up with. Number one being the cuticle and stomata to slow down water loss and evaporation, and then number two being vascular tissue to help get water from the soil to the rest of the plant. Okay, so where would this trait of vascular tissue be on this tree? All right, if you said D, vascular tissue would go here, you would be correct. So remember, we've got the green plants here that include green algae and everything up. And then we've got the land plants here that includes the non-vascular plants like bryophytes, the seedless vascular plants, the gymnosperms, and then the angiosperms, okay? And so when we talk about non-vascular plants, seedless vascular plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms, it's only this group, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, so the ferns, the pine trees, and the flowering and fruiting plants that have vascular tissue. These bryophytes or mosses, they do not have vascular tissue. They only have a stomata and cuticle. And this is part of the reason when you think about sort of a bryophyte or a moss, you don't think about them being long or tall. They're all very low and grown to the ground. And part of that is because they don't have vascular tissue that allows them to grow really tall, because they don't have that vascular tissue that can distribute water and nutrients up to those taller parts of the plant. So that basically limits their growth patterns. And where would the traits cell walls and vacuoles be on this tree? All right. If you said B, you are correct. So cell walls and vacuoles are traits that all green plants have, including the green algae. So the last thing that I want to touch on, so at this point we've talked about some of these major adaptations that plants have to osmoregulate. We talked about a vacuole and a cell wall. We've talked about a cuticle and a stomata that are unique to the land plants. And then we've talked about vascular tissue that's unique to these vascular plants. So lastly, I want to talk about some other structural adaptations that plants have evolved to reduce water loss and deal with osmoregulation. One of these major adaptations is just reduced leaf size. So one example is just the smaller and smaller and smaller you make your leaf, the less evapotranspiration that's going to happen, so the less water loss you'll have. And so typically, if you look at plants in drier habitats, they're going to have much smaller leaves, and plants in wetter habitats, because they don't have to worry about water loss, they'll have much, much bigger leaves because they're not worried about losing lots of water to photosynthesis, which happens when you have a much, much bigger leaf. And in fact, the thorns that we see on cacti, those are actually reduced leaves. So thorns are derived or have evolved from leaves, and thorns are very, very reduced and hardened leaves. And basically cacti have evolved to basically turn their leaves into these thorns, and those thorns protect them from getting damaged by other plants that want to come in, or other herbivores that want to come and eat the plant and steal some of the water from the plant. So this is another way that plants have reduced leaf size to protect themselves and reduce water loss. Another example are hairs that can reflect solar radiation and slow air movement. So oftentimes in drier habitats, you'll find plants that have lots and lots of fine fuzzy hairs on them. And essentially what those hairs do is reduce water loss from evaporation by, once again, reflecting solar radiation, so basically reducing the amount of sunlight that gets on them, and also slowing air movement so the water doesn't dry up by getting blown off. Another adaptation are something that we call sunken stomata. And what sunken stomata are, basically you have this sort of like crypt or this sort of longer opening before you get to the actual stomata. And so the stomata can stay open without losing as much water, because this sort of crypt area will stay more moist in here than the other environment. And so there's less evaporation and water loss when you have these sunken stomata. And so once again, this is an adaptation that you'll see plants of evolving in drier habitats. And another thing that's kind of cool that plants can do is they can actually reorient their leaves. And typically what you'll see is a vertical orientation in desert plants to avoid direct rays of the sun. And this once again reduces the amount of evaporation and transpiration that's happening on plants and water loss. Okay, so that's it for now. Please keep an eye out for announcements and upcoming assignments.